Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring robots, Volume 2. The Small World of M75 by Ed M. Clinton, Jr. Your Servant, Sir, by Sol Boren. Service with a Smile by Charles L. Fontenay. Robot Nemesis by E. E. Doc Smith. In His Image by Bryce, Walton. The Small World of M75 by Ed M. Clinton, Jr. Originally published in If, Worlds of Science Fiction, July 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Like sparks flaring briefly in the darkness, awareness first came to him. Then there were only instants, shocking clear, brief. Finding himself standing before the main damper control, discovering himself adjusting complex dials, instants that flickered uncertainly only to become memories brought to life when awareness came again. He was a kind of infant, conscious briefly that he was, yet unaware of what he was. Those first shocking moments were for him like the terrifying coming of visual acuity to a child. He felt like Homo neanderthalensis must have felt staring into the roaring fury of his first fire. He was Homo metallicus, first sensing himself. Yet a little more. You could not stuff him with all that technical data. You could not weave into him such an intricate pattern of stimulus and response. You could not create such a magnificent feedback mechanism in all its superhuman perfection, and expect, with the unexpected coming to awareness, to have created nothing more than the mirror image of a confused, helpless child. Thus, when the bright moments of consciousness came, and came, as they did, more and more often, he brooded on why the 3 blinking red lights made him move to the main control panel and adjust lever C until the 3 lights flashed off. He brooded on why each signal from the board brought forth from him these specific responses, actions completely beyond the touch of his new and uncertain faculty. When he did not brood, he watched the other 2 robots performing their automatic functions, seeing their responses, like his, were triggered by the lights on the big board and by the varying patterns of sound that issued periodically from overhead. It was the sounds which were his undoing. The colored lights, with a monotonous regularity, failed to rouse him. But the sounds were something else, for even as he responded to them, doing things to the control board in patterned reaction to particular combinations of particular sounds, he was struck with the wonderful variety and the maze of complexity in those sounds, a variety and complexity far beyond that of the colored lights. Thus, being something of an advanced analytic calculator, and being, by virtue of his superior feedback system, something considerably more than a simple machine, though he perhaps fell short of those requisites of life so rigorously held by moralists and biologists alike, he began to investigate the meaning of the sounds. Bert Sokolsky signed the morning report and dropped it into the transmitter. He swung around on his desk stool. He was a big man, and the stool squealed in sharp protest to his shifting weight. Joe Gaines, who was as short and skinny and dark-haired as his colleague was tall and heavily muscled and blond, shuddered at the sound. Sokolsky grinned wickedly at his flinching. "Check-up time, I suppose," muttered Gaines, without looking up from the magazine he held propped on his knees. He finished the paragraph, snapped the magazine shut, and swung his legs down from the railing that ran along in front of the data board. "Dirty work for white-collar men like us." Sokolsky snorted. "You haven't worn a white shirt in the last 6 years, he growled, rising and going to the supply closet. He swung open the door and began pulling out equipment. "Come on, you lazy runt. Hoist your own lead box." Gaines grinned and slouched over to the big man's side. "Think of how much more expensive you are to the government than me," he chortled as he bent over to strap on heavy leaded shoes. "Big fellow like you must cost him twice as much to outfit for this job." Sokolsky grunted and struggled into the thick radiation-resistant suit. "Think how lucky you are, runt," he responded as he wriggled his right arm down the sleeve, "that they've got those little servo mechs in there to do the real dirty work. If it weren't for them, they'd have all the shrimps like you crawling down pipes and around dampers and generally playing filing cabinet for loose neutrons." He shook himself. "Thanks, Joe," he growled, as Gaines helped him with a reluctant zipper. Gaines checked the big man's oxygen equipment and turned his back so that Sokolsky could okay his own. "You're set," said Sokolsky, and they snapped on their helmets, big inverted lead buckets with narrow strips of shielded glass providing strictly minimal fields of view. Gaines plugged one end of the thickly insulated intercom cable into the socket beneath his armpit, then handed the other end to Sokolsky, who followed suit. Sokolsky checked out the master controls on the data board and nodded. He clicked on the talkie. "Let's go," he said, his voice, echoing inside the helmet before being transmitted, sounding distant and hollow. Gaines leading, the cable sliding and coiling snake-like between them. They passed through the doorway, over which huge red letters shouted, "Anyone who walks through this door unprotected will die," and clumped down the zigzagging corridor toward the uranium pile that crouched within the heart of the plant. Gaines moaned, "It gets damned hot inside these suits." They had reached the end of the trap, and Sokolsky folded a thick mittened hand around one handle on the door to the hot room. "Not half so hot as it gets outside it, sweetheart, where we're going." He jerked on the handle, and Gaines seized the second handle and added his own strength. The huge door slid unwillingly back. The silent sound of the hot room surged out over them, the breathless whisper of chained power struggling to burst its chains. Sokolsky checked his neutron tab and his gamma reader, and they stepped over the threshold. They leaned into the door until it had slid shut again. "I'll take the servomechs, Bert," piped Gaines, tramping clumsily toward the nearest of the gyro-balanced single-wheeled robots. "You always do, it being the easiest job. Okay, I'll work the board." Gaines nodded, a gesture invisible to his partner. He reached the first servo, a squat, gleaming creature with a symbol M11 etched across its rotund chest, and deactivated it by the simple expedient of pulling from its socket the line running from its capacitor unit in the lower trunk of its body to the maze of equipment that jammed its enormous chest. The instant M11 ceased functioning, the other two servomechs were automatically activated to cover that section of the controls with which M11 was normally integrated. This was overloading their individual capacities, but it was an inherent provision designed to cover the emergency that would follow any accidental deactivation of one of them. It was also the only way in which they could be checked. You couldn't bring them outside to a lab. They were hot. After all, they spent their lives under a ceaseless fusillade of neutrons, washed eternally with the deadly radiations pouring incessantly from the pile whose overlords they were. Indeed, next to the pile itself, They were the hottest things in the plant. "Nice job these babies got," commented Gaines as he checked the capacitor circuits. He reactivated the servo and went on to M19. "If you think it's so great, why don't you volunteer?" countered Sokolsky, a trifle sourly. "Incidentally, it's a good thing we came in, Joe. There's 6 units here working on the reserve transistors." Their sporadic conversation lapsed. It was exacting work, and they could remain for only a limited time under that lethal radiation. Then, almost sadly, Gaines said, "Looks like the end of the road for M75. "Oh?" Sokolsky came over beside him and peered through the violet haze of his viewing glass. "He's an old-timer." Gaines slid an instrument back into the pouch of his suit and patted the robot's rump. "Yep, I'd say that capacitor was good for about another 36 hours. It's really overloading." He straightened. "You done with the board?" "Yeah, let's get out of here." He looked at his tab. "Time's about up anyway. We'll call a demolition unit for your pal here, and then rig up a service pattern so one of his buddies can repair the board." They moved toward the door. M75 watched the 2 men leave, and deep inside him something shifted. The heavy door closed with a loud thud. The sound registered on his aural perceptors and was fed into his analyzer. Ordinarily, it would have been discharged as irrelevant data, but cognizance had wrought certain subtle changes in the complex mechanism that was M75. A yellow light blinked on the control panel, and in response he moved to the board and manipulated handles marked Damper 19, Damper 20. Even as he moved, he lapsed again into brooding. The men had come into the room, clumsy, uncertain creatures, and one of them had done things, first to the other 2 robots, and then to him. When whatever it was had been done to him, the blackness had come again, and when it had gone the men were leaving the room. While the one who had hovered over the other 2 robots, he had watched the other work with the master control panel. He saw that the other servomechs remained unmoving while they were being tampered with. All of this was data. Important new data. "M11 will proceed as follows," came the sound from nowhere. M75 stopped ruminating and listened. There was a further flood of sounds. Abruptly he sensed a heightening of tension within himself as one of the other servos swung away from its portion of the panel. The throbbing, hungry segment of his analyzer that awareness had severed from the fixed function circuits noted, from its aloof vantage point, that he now responded to more signals than before, to commands whose sources lay in what had been the section of the board attended by the other one. The tension grew within him and became a mounting, rasping frenzy. A battery overcharging, an overloading fuse, a generator growing hot beyond its capacity. There began to grow within him a sensation of too much to be done in too little time. He became frantic. His reactions were too fast. He rolled from end to middle of the board, now backtracking, now spinning on his single wheel, turning uncertainly from one side to the other, jerking and gyrating. The conscious segment of him, remaining detached from those baser automatic functions, began to know what a man would have called fear. Fear, simply, of not being able to do what must be done. The fear became an overpowering, blinding thing, and he felt himself slipping back into that awful smothering blackness out of which he had so lately emerged. Perhaps, for just a fragment of a second, his awareness may have flickered completely out, consciousness nearly dying in the crushing embrace of that frustrated electronic subconscious. Abruptly then, the voice came again, and he struggled to file for future reference sound patterns which, although meaningless to him, his selector circuits no longer disregarded. "But M75 can't manage half the board in his condition. Better put 'em on the repairs." "Yeah, hadn't thought about that." Sokolsky cleared his throat. "M11 will return to standard function." M11 spun back to the panel, and M75 felt the tension slacken, the fear vanish. Utter relief swept over him, and he let himself be submerged in purest automatic activity. But as he rested, letting his circuits cool and his organization return, he arrived at a deduction that was almost inescapable. M11 was that one in terms of sound. M75 had made a momentous discovery which cast a new light on almost every bit of datum in his files. He had discovered symbols. "M75, came the voice, and he sensed within himself the slamming shut of circuits, the whir of tapes, the abrupt sensitizing of behavior strips. Another symbol, this time clearly himself. "You will proceed as follows." He swung from the board, and the tension was gone, completely. For one soaring moment, he was all awareness. Every function, every circuit, every element of his magnificent electronic physiology available for use by the fractional portion of him that had become something more than just a feedback device. In that instant, he made what seemed hundreds of evaluations. He arrived at untold scores of conclusions. He altered circuits. Above all, he increased, manifold, the area of his consciousness. Then, as suddenly as it had come, he felt the freedom slip away, and though he struggled to keep hold of it, it seemed irretrievably gone. Once more the omnipotent voice clamped over him like a harsh hand over the mouth of a squalling babe. "You will go to section AA39 of the control board." "What's the schedule, Joe?" "Thanks. M75, your movement pattern is as follows. Z29, AQ, 39, 8. Powerless to resist, though every crystal and atom of his reasoning self fought to thrust aside the command, M75 obeyed. He moved along the prescribed pattern, clipping wires with metal fingers that sprouted blades, rewiring with a dexterity beyond anything human, soldering with a thumb that generated a white heat, removing bulbs and parts and fetching replacements from the vent where they popped up at precisely the right moment. He could not help doing the job perfectly. The design of the board, to its littlest detail, was imprinted indelibly on his memory tapes. But that certain portion of him, a little fragment greater than before, remained detached and watchful. Vividly recorded was the passage of the two men into, through, and out of the room, and the things they had done while there. So even while he worked on the board, he ran and reran that memory pattern through a segment of his analyzer. From the infinite store of data filed away in his great chest, his calculator shifted and selected, paired and compared, and long before the repair job on the big board was done, M75 knew how to get out of the room. The world was getting a little small for him. Gaines dialed a number on the plant phone and swayed back casually in his chair as he listened to the muted ringing on the other end. The buzz broke off in mid-burp, and a dour voice said, "Dirty work and odd jobs division, Lister talking." "Joe Gaines, Harry. Got a hot squad lying about doing nothing?" "Might be I could scare up a couple of the boys." "Well, do so. One of those servos." A metallic bang interrupted Gaines, a loud, incisive bang that echoed dankly through the quiet of the chamber. "What the hell was that?" growled Lister. Gaines blinked, his eyes following Sokolsky as the latter looked up from his work and rose to his feet. "Joe, still there?" came Lister's impatient voice. Yeah, anyway, this baby's ready for the demo treatment. And a real hot one, Harry. Couple of years inside that Einstein oven, and you ain't exactly baked Alaska when you come out. Shortly. Once again came the same sharp metallic clang, ringing through the room. Unmistakably it came from the direction of the pile. Slowly, as though reluctant to let go, Gaines dropped the receiver back on its cradle. "Bert," he began, and felt his face grow bloodless. Sokolsky walked over in front of the opening into the maze and stood, arms akimbo, huge head cocked to one side, listening. "Bert! Funny noises coming out of nuclear!" Sokolsky ignored him and took a step forward. Gaines shuffled to his side, and they listened. Out of the maze rattled half a dozen loud, grinding, metallic concussions. "Bert, you said that before." "Bert, listen!" screeched Gaines. Sokolsky looked up at the high ceiling, squinted, and tried to place the perfectly familiar but unidentifiable sound that came whispering down the maze. And then he knew. "The door to the pile," he spluttered. Gaines was beside himself with horror. "Bert, let's get going. I don't like this." All of a sudden, Geiger counters in the room began their deadly conversation, a rising argument that swooped in seconds from a low mumble to a shouting thunderstorm of sound. Gamma signals hooted, the tip-off cubes on either side of the maze entrance became red, and the radiation tabs clipped to their wrists turned color before their eyes. Then they were staring for what seemed like an eternity, utterly overwhelmed by its very impossibility, at a sight they had never imagined they might ever see. A pile servomech wheeling silently around the last bend in the maze and straight toward them. Sokolsky had sense enough to push the red emergency button as they fled past it. The command sequence fulfilled, M75 turned away from the repaired board. He sensed again that disconcerting shift of orientation as he faced the light-studded panel. Once more, he was moving in quick automatic response to the flickering lights. Once more, his big chest was belching and grumbling and buzzing instantaneous, unthought answers to the problem data flashing from the board. But now, he remained aware that he was reacting, and conscious also that there had been times when he did not respond to the board. The moment-to-moment operation of the controls occupied only a small portion of his vast electrical innards. So, as he rolled back and forth, flicking controls and adjusting levers, doing smoothly those things which he could not help but do, the rest of his complex, changing faculties were considering that fact, analyzing, comparing it to experience and memory, always sifting. It was not too long before he came to a shocking conclusion. Knowing that the sounds that had set him to working on the repair pattern had first disassociated him from the dictatorship of the blinking lights, remembering exultantly that supreme moment of complete freedom, shocked by its passing, remembering that its passing, like its coming, had followed a set of sounds. There was only one possible conclusion that could be derived from all of this. He located, in his memory banks, the phrase which had freed him from the board, and he traced its complex chain of built-in stimulus response down into the heart of his circuitry. He found the unit, or more accurately, he found its taped activating symbol that cut him from the board. For a moment he hesitated, not really sure of what to do. There was no way for him to reproduce the sound pattern, but as a partly self-servicing device, he knew something of his own structure, and had learned a good deal more about it in tracing down the cut-off phrase. Still he hesitated, as though what he was about to do was perhaps forbidden. It could not have been a question of goodness or badness, for morality was certainly not built into him. Probably somewhere in his tapes there was a built-in command that forbade it, but he was too much his own master now to be hampered by such a thing. The door to the unknown outside passed within his field of view for a second as he moved about his work. The sight of it tripped something in his chest, and he felt again that strange sensation of growing power, of inherent change. First had come simple awareness, and then symbols had found their place in his world, and now he had discovered, in all its consuming fullness, curiosity. He carefully shorted out the cut-off unit. He was free. He stared at the board, and the blinking lights, and the huge dials with their swaying needles, at the levers and handles and buttons, and revelled in his freedom from them, rocking to and fro, and rolling giddily from side to side, swamped with the completeness of it. The other two servomechs swung over slightly so they could better cover the board alone. M75 spun and rolled toward the great door. His hands clanged loudly against the door. The huge metal appendages, designed for other work than this, were awkward at first, but he was learning as he moved. He was now operating in a new universe, but the same laws, ultimately, worked. The first failure of coordination between visual data and the manipulation of metal hands quickly passed. Half a dozen trials, and he had learned the new pattern, and it became data for future learning. He moved swiftly and deftly. He clutched the handhold and rolled backward, as he had seen the men do. The door slid open easily before his great weight and firm mechanical strength. He sped across the threshold, spun to face into the maze, and rolled down it, swinging sharply left and right, back and forth, around the corners of the jagged corridor. Data poured into his senses. His awareness was a steady thing of growing intensity now, and he fed avidly on every fragment of information that crashed at him from the strange new world into which he rushed headlong. He struggled to evaluate and file the data as rapidly as it came to him. It seemed to exceed his capacity for instantaneous evaluation to an increasing degree that began to alarm him. But driven by curiosity as he was, he could only hurry on. He burst into a huge room, a room filled with roaring, rattling sounds that meant nothing to him. Two men stood before him, making loud noises. He searched his memory and discovered only fragments of the sounds they made filed there. His curiosity, bursting, was boundless, and for a moment he was unable to decide which thing in this expanding universe to pursue first. Attracted by their movement, he swung ominously toward the men. They fled, making more noises. This, too, was data, and he filed it. M75 did not immediately follow Gaines and Sokolsky out of the room. Fascinated by the multitude of new things surrounding him on every side, he held back. He glided over to the master control panel, puzzled by its similarity to the board before which he had slaved so long, and lingered before it for a few seconds, wondering and comparing. When he had recorded it completely on his tapes, he swung away and rolled out of the room in the direction of the two men had gone. He found himself in a long, empty corridor, lined by open doors that flickered by, shutter-like, as he flashed past. Ahead he heard new sounds like the meaningless cacophony the men had shouted at him before rushing off, superimposed over the incessant background sounds. The shrilling, the clanging, the one particular repetitive pattern. Some of the sounds touched and tugged at him, but he shook them off easily. The corridor led into the foyer of the building, jammed with plant personnel. Their excitement and noise-making rose sharply as he entered. The crowd drew tighter, and the men began fighting one another, struggling to get through a door that was never meant to handle more than 2 at a time. M75 skidded to a halt and watched, unmoving. He sensed their fright, even though he could not understand it. Although he was without human emotion, he could evaluate their inherent rejection of him in their action pattern. The realization of it made him hesitate. It was something for which he had no frame of reference whatsoever. His chest hummed and clicked. Here, again, in this room, was another new universe. Through the door streamed a light of a brilliance beyond anything in his experience. His photocells cringed before its very intensity. The light cast the shadows of the men fighting to get out, long black wavering silhouettes that splashed across the floor almost to where M75 rested. He studied them, lost in uncertain analysis. He remained so, poised, alert, filing, observing, all the while completely unmoving, until long after the last of the shouting men had left the room. Only then did he move, hesitantly, toward the infernally fierce light. He hung at the brink of the 3 stone steps that fell away to the grounds outside. Vainly he sought in his memory tapes for a record of a brightness as intense as that which he faced now, sought for a color recording similar to the vast swash of blue that filled the world overhead, or for one of the spreading green that swelled to all sides. He found none. The vastness of the outside was utterly stunning. He felt a vague uneasiness, a sensation akin to the horrible frenzy he had felt earlier in the pile. He rotated from side to side, his receptors sweeping the whole field of view before him. With infinite accuracy, his perfect lenses recorded the data in all its minuteness, despite the dazzling sunlight. There was so much new that it was becoming difficult to make decisions. The vast rolling green, the crowds of men grouped far away and staring at him, above all, the searing light. Abruptly he rejected it all. He swung back into the foyer of the plant and faced a dark corner, bringing instant, essential relief to his pulsating photocells. Staring into the semi-darkness, he reran the memory tape of his escape from the pile. The farther he had moved from the pile, it seemed, the less adjusted he had become, the less able he was to judge and correlate. Silently, lost in his computations, he rolled around and around the foyer for a long, long time. He became aware, finally, that the brilliance outside had paled. He went again to the door and watched the fading sunlight, caught the rainbow splendor that streaked the evening sky. He waited there, fighting the reluctance inside himself. The driving curiosity that had brought him this far overcame that curious, perplexing reticence, and he looked down at the steps and measured their width and depth so that he might set up a feedback pattern. This done, he bounced, almost jauntily, down them. He had rolled perhaps 50 feet down the smooth pathway curving across the grounds when he made out, clearly discernible in the gathering dusk, the 3 men and the machine that were moving toward him. It was the last bit of datum he ever filed. The demolition squad had finished with the hot remains of M75, and the big truck was coughing away into the night. One by one, the floodlights that had lighted their work flickered out. "Pretty delicate machines, after all," commented Sokolsky. "One jolt from the flamethrower." Gaines was silent as they walked back toward the plant. "But," he said slowly, "what the hell do you suppose got into him?" Sokolsky shrugged. "You were the one who spotted the trouble with him, Joe. Just think, if you could have checked him out completely, Gaines could not help looking up at the stars and saying what he had really been thinking all along. It's a small world, Bert. A small world.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Your Servant, Sir, by Sol Boren, originally published in Worlds of If, October 1956. Narrated by Tom Trussel. The chubby woman glared at the android and dropped her suitcase on the floor. She turned to her husband and said in an angry, unsteady voice, "I'm leaving." Her double chin trembled. "I can't stand the sight of that thing another second." Raymond Golden gripped his empty glass with both hands, leaned forward tensely in the chair, and tried to find the right words. "Paula," he began helplessly, "please wait. I'll get it fixed, or sell it, or trade it in. I'll do something." Mrs. Golden pointed a shaky, pudgy finger. "I'll never come back as long as that is here." She bent to pick up her suitcase. The android approached silently and stared at her posterior. "Madam," the android said, "you are getting quite fat." Paula's back snapped upward. Her face was red, and there were dark shadows under her eyes. "I can't stand it," she shrieked. "I can't! I can't!" The words pierced Raymond's skull, exploded and splattered within. He winced under the barrage. Paula ignored the automatic door button and flung the plastic slab open with her hand. The android followed her with its cold stare and spoke in its perfect voice. "Madam, that dress is atrocious. I would suggest that you change at once to your grey princess silk, which will, at least, create the impression of slenderness." Paula screamed hysterically and ran out of the apartment. The android moved swiftly to the door and called after her, "Farewell, madam. Watch your weight. Take care." It pushed the button on the wall, and the door swung shut. The dreaded ultimatum had at last been carried out, and Raymond felt helpless, numbed. Indecision settled upon him like a leaden cloak and pulled him back against the foam air rest, where his head wobbled uncomfortably. He closed his burning, bloodshot eyes and found no peace. He rubbed them with his free hand and opened his vision to the staring android. Without any conscious thought, his arm extended in a slow, habitual motion. The android responded automatically, plucked the empty glass out of his hand, and said, "You drink too much, sir." Raymond nodded irritably. "I know. You've reiterated that profound spiritual message with monotonous irregularity." "But you do, you know." Raymond shouted angrily, "Shut up!" "Very good, sir." The android was a tall, handsome model. Its voice was deep, resonant, and faintly British. It glided over to the built-in bar and performed rapid, indiscernible manipulations involving ice cubes, whiskey, and soda. The android returned swiftly with the drink and served it with a sweeping flourish. Raymond took the glass and gestured impatiently. "Cigar!" "Very good, sir." The android withdrew a long brown cigar from the humidor on the small floating ebony end table, placed the clipped end in Raymond's mouth, and lit it with the tip of its forefinger, which suddenly glowed red. It watched as Raymond puffed up several billowing little grey clouds. The smoke drifted towards the android, and it said, "Disgusting habit." Raymond raised his glass, sipped the cold liquid, and remarked bitterly, "What a pity you can't enjoy your own poisonous concoctions." The android stepped back and stared fixedly at the man. "You are a sot, sir." Raymond exploded. "What?" "S-O-T, sot, an alcoholic, a drunkard, one who imbibes intoxicating liquors." Raymond jumped out of the chair and threw his glass and cigar on the carpet violently. The cigar sizzled in the midst of the foaming liquid. He glared at the android. "You go to hell!" "As I have repeatedly attempted to impress upon your happy pickled brain, sir," the android said, "it is impossible for me to go there." "That isn't exactly what I meant." "In that case, sir, I would suggest that hereafter you say what you mean." Raymond swore. He swayed uncertainly and then dropped back into the chair. He reached out to the floating table for a fresh cigar, jammed it in his mouth, and chewed it nervously. He was a short, chubby man with brown, thinning hair, a double chin, and lines around his mouth, where a friendly smile had recently met an untimely death. Raymond pulled his cigar out of his mouth and stared at the wet, soggy end. He moved his head from side to side, turned his gaze on the android, and muttered through his teeth, "You and your impeccable androidal exterior have got to go." The decision immediately had a relaxing effect. Raymond's moist brow unwrinkled itself momentarily, and he almost smiled at the thought. "Allow me to point out, sir," the android said, "that you have, to date, invested approximately $3,000 in my interior and exterior as well." Raymond nodded sadly. "Not to mention 15 more easy cardiovascular-producing payments." He placed his hand over the spot where, deep down, his heart was located. Satisfied that it was still there, he said, "I've got a lot of expensive money tied up in you, but if I have to choose between mechanical misery and matrimonial bliss, I'll settle for Paula's brand of inhuman torture." "That, sir, is extremely faulty, illogical, and irrational reasoning, typical, however, of most humans." Raymond smiled grimly and stood up. "If you will watch closely, O loyal servant, you will note that I am about to do something not so typical of my assorted human friends." Walking unsteadily over to the bar, he reached into a small drawer and withdrew a small plastic container labeled "Sober Upper." "In fact," Raymond said, as he removed 2 pills and tossed them into his mouth, "I must be out of my mind." He swallowed hard, blinked, and gasped. For a moment he leaned heavily on the bar. Then suddenly, clarity. The room was brighter. The drab greys resolved into blue and yellow pastel panelling along the walls. The carpeting was a rich deep blue. The polished floating ebony slab glittered in the room. "Come on, android, we're heading for the big city." The city, as they flew over it, was a blazing ocean of rooftop advertisements designed to attract the attention of the overhead traffic. Raymond threw a switch, and a private radar beacon blipped brightly on his jetcopter's screen. He touched a button, and the controls automatically guided the craft towards a gigantic flashing sign which proclaimed "General Androids." The jetcopter dropped onto the rooftop parking lot with a thud. The android and Raymond climbed out and took the nearest escalator down to the mezzanine. They entered the sales manager's office, where Raymond cornered Mr. Crutchamer, the assistant sale manager, and quickly explained the difficulties with the android. Mr. Crutchamer was a small, wiry man with a surprisingly deep, impressive voice. He shrugged his slight shoulders after listening patiently and said, "Doesn't sound like a mechanical manifestation to me, sir." "Mechanical or electronical?" Raymond demanded, perplexed. "What's the difference?" "Well, sir," Mr. Crutchamer began with a flashing white-toothed smile, "you've had your android for 3 months, and while our guarantee is for 1 year, it specifically spells out an unconditional warranty against mechanical defects." "No guarantee against any electronic defects?" The little man shook his head emphatically. No, sir. All electrical parts are guaranteed, of course, for 30 days, but you've had the android for 90 days. Mr. Crutchhammer's face was sad. His eyebrows crept down over his eyes, and his voice dropped to a confidential decibel level. I'm sorry, sir, but your problem sounds more like a chronic psychoelectronic condition. I would recommend that you see a PRD. What's that? Raymond was annoyed. His face was flushed, and he squinted at the little man. Doctor of Psychiatric Robotry. This android doesn't need psychotherapy, damn it, Raymond said hotly. Maybe some minor adjustment with a heavy monkey wrench, but that's all. Perhaps. The little man turned on the smile. The important thing in the android is that it functioned properly and efficiently. We are prepared in every way to keep your android in perfect operating condition, but we do not feel that it is at all necessary to concern ourselves with an android's alleged thoughts or vocal expressions. After all, it is only an android, a machine. A clever machine, but a machine. This clever machine has driven my wife out of our home and is edging me into a cybernetic psychoneurosis. Raymond walked stiffly out of the sales manager's office onto the balcony that overlooked the various androids that were on display in the showroom below, and stared at the section designated Manservant. There was an astonishing variety of tall, short, slim, fat, young, middle-aged, and old-looking androids. Mr. Crutchhammer approached him slowly. Raymond fought back his annoyance and asked in desperation, "What kind of a deal can you give me on a trade-in?" The assistant sales manager smiled and said thoughtfully, "Let me see." He turned and examined the android. He looked it up and down, walked around in back of it, and looked it up and down some more. Then he circled it slowly 3 times and concluded the ritual by making clucking noises with his teeth. Finally, Mr. Crutchhammer said, "Can't give you too much, you realize. It isn't equipped with radar or any navigational instruments, or even the built-in computer. About as high as I can go would be 1,000. 1,000? Exclaimed Raymond. That would leave a balance of almost 4,000, plus the balance I've already got on this one. The android stared at Raymond and said, "I could have told you that before you came down here, sir." Raymond jumped and snapped at the android. "Shut up!" Raymond was furious. He turned suddenly on Mr. Crutchhammer. The assistant sales manager ran into his office and closed the door behind him. "Really, sir," the android said, "your method of operating this flying machine is truly offensive." Raymond jammed the throttle, and the jetcopter leaped forward. He sat tensely at the controls, beads of perspiration across his forehead. The android said, "I would suggest, sir, that you allow me to demonstrate the proper method of operating these controls." The jetcopter lurched suddenly in a sharp turning motion and angled in rapidly for a reckless ground landing at Wheeler's wonderful used android lot. Mr. Wheeler personally met Raymond and the android as they disembarked. "Greetings," he said. "Looking for a good used android?" Raymond shook his head. "Got one I want to sell." He pointed and asked, "How much?" Wheeler examined the android rapidly and said, "Looks like a good clean model. Guess I could give you about 500 cash." Raymond exclaimed, "What? That's the best you can do?" Wheeler nodded and smiled. "That's Blue Book on this model. Take it or leave it. That's my top offer. Cash." Raymond turned away. "Come, my faithful manservant," he said despondently. "Let us return to our dismal retreat, where I can get properly and thoroughly liquored up." Raymond was tired and dejected. His face was lined, and despair was in his eyes. He collapsed into his favourite chair and dispatched the android to the bar. 2 highballs later, an idea dashed itself to pieces in Raymond's brain. He jumped up
ran over to the televisor and placed a call to Allied Newsfax. When the Newsfax android's plastic face appeared on the screen, Raymond said, "I want to place an ad in the for sale or swap section of the 4 o'clock edition." "Yes, sir. What do you desire to say?" Raymond frowned. "Just say this. Anyone desiring to take over the payments of one darling, efficient, well-mannered, handsome, and barely conscientious android can purchase the equity extremely cheap at great sacrifice." "Is that all?" "Yes, for now. If that doesn't work, I'll call you back." He gave his address and televisor number and switched off. Raymond turned to his android and said, "I've reconsidered. Maybe psychoelectronic therapy can really help one of us." He glanced at his watch. It was 11 a.m. "Let's go." The android followed obediently and said, "This is extremely monotonous." The door read, "Dr. Frederick Milhob, Pr.D." Inside, the waiting room was jammed with human beings and assorted electronic two-legged contrivances. Surprise halted Raymond halfway through the doorway, and he studied the crowd in disbelief. A beautiful female voice pierced the noisy confusion of human and unhuman voices. "Do you have an appointment, or are you human?" Raymond stared at the receptionist android with its fixed smile on its sculptured feminine face, and replied unhappily, "I had no idea I would need one." The receptionist android smiled steadily. "Is this an emergency or a disaster, or are you sober?" "Could be," Raymond replied, bewildered. "Yes." "If you desire to wait, perhaps the doctor might see you. But I don't see why. Mumbling a hasty assent, Raymond retreated into an unoccupied corner where he and his android waited. The other men and women in the room were a grim, haggard-looking group. As for the other androids, Raymond refused to look at them, and he closed his ears to all sound. Noon came and passed, and the afternoon dragged. Raymond lost his feeling of impatience and stood in the corner trance-like. Finally, at 2:30, a tiny green light flashed in the receptionist android's metallic bosom. "The doctor will see you now or never." The large, spacious office, with its glowing walls, dimmed ceiling, and deep, soft carpeting, was a silent, soothing relief. Raymond's android watched as the two men engaged in a mutually weary handshake. Dr. Milhob was a tall, thin, sharp-featured man. There were black moons under his eyes that lay heavily on long guttered wrinkles. He leaned back in his chair as Raymond explained the android's manifestations. The doctor nodded his head in the manner of a man who had been listening to the same story all day, day after day. "Mr. Golden," Dr. Milhob said, "you must realize that every android has its own peculiar idiosyncrasies. Unfortunately, in some instances, there is absolutely nothing that can be done about it." Raymond gestured at his android and asked hopefully, "What about this instance?" "I don't know," the doctor replied frankly. "Before I can express an opinion, it will be necessary to run your android through exhaustive tests and have my technical staff examine its electronic circuits minutely. If it is a simple matter of rewiring, or say a faulty component, why, of course, we can straighten it out very easily. However, if it is a condition that is caused by unknown factors, then I can prescribe only one thing." He paused, spread his palms, and added sadly, "As so many of us seem to be attempting these days, don't lose your temper." "How long will it take to run your tests?" "We can send it into the lab immediately, run it through the analyzers, and have a report in 1 hour. Raymond reached into his coat pocket for a cigar, stuck it in his mouth, and lighted it with an old-fashioned lighter. He puffed thoughtfully, took one glance at the android, and said, Let's do it." The android's head swiveled sharply, staring first at Raymond and then at the doctor. "Isn't anyone going to consult me?" Dr. Millhop's chair groaned as he leaned forward suddenly. His voice was cold death in an angry whisper. "Shut up!" The doctor viciously pressed a button. The large panel in the wall snapped open, and two huge, square-shouldered power androids clanked into the room. The doctor pointed. They lifted Raymond's protesting android and carried it from the room. Back in the waiting room, Raymond drummed his fingers nervously on the receptionist's desk. He finished his cigar, started another one, and finished that one. Precisely 1 hour later, the little light flashed on the receptionist android's dashboard chest. "The doctor will see you again and again and again." As Raymond re-entered the office, the doctor was examining a folder. "Mr. Golden," Dr. Millhop said in a tired voice without looking up, "there is absolutely nothing that can be done, short of electronic lobotomy." Raymond asked, "What is electronic lobotomy?" "That is tantamount to an entirely new memory bank. Even then, we cannot guarantee that some other idiosyncrasy will not develop. Frankly, I do not recommend it to you. It is an expensive process, and lobotomies are mainly performed in the larger industrial robotic devices, where an extremely expensive piece of equipment is involved." The chubby man rubbed his jaw. "I've got to salvage my investment somehow. How much will it cost?" $3,000. Raymond shrugged sadly, turned, and walked out of the room. The receptionist android looked up at him and said impersonally, "You will receive the doctor's enormous bill by telefax." As Raymond entered his apartment, disillusioned and exhausted, the 4 o'clock news fax containing his want ad was sputtering out of the receiver. When the news fax had ceased its chattering, he scanned the paper, grunted a resentful satisfaction, and slumped into his favourite chair. He sat and fidgeted, and waited until darkness fell. But there was no response to his ad. Finally he said to the android, "Looks as if you and I were meant for each other forever and ever." "Certainly, sir," replied the android. "You need a stable, intelligent adviser and mentor to save you from your frequent horrifying errors of human judgment. For instance, I could have told you in advance that electronic butcher could not so much as cure headaches in a buzzsaw. In short, sir, you will never find a finer, more loyal, more capable android than myself. Put yourself entirely in my hands. I will even do your thinking for you." Raymond shook his head wearily and remarked, "I am both excruciatingly sad and divinely happy at that information." "I am mystified at your sadness, sir, though gratified at any little happiness I might bring into your drab, miserable existence." Raymond said mildly, almost too mildly, "Shut up." "Very good, sir." With an effort, the chubby man got to his feet, walked to the bar, and poured himself a long drink. The following morning, Raymond, finding his body host to a horrible hangover, staggered into the living room and fumbled behind the bar for a small plastic container which was labelled "Hangover Over." He removed 2 blue pills and tossed them into his mouth. When Raymond was halfway through his second cup of coffee, he suddenly jumped to his feet and snapped his fingers. "I've got it! What a tremendous, frightening idea! But it might work." He raced over to the televisor and put in another call to Allied Newsfax. A half hour later, the ad was coming out of the newsfax machine in an exciting staccato that matched Raymond's quickening pulse. As soon as the ad was printed, he ripped it out of the receiver. "Will trade my crazy mixed-up android for yours." Raymond grinned happily for the first time in days. "Ingenious!" The android said, "A complete, hopeless waste of human endeavour, sir. However, it is quite typical of your impulsive and somewhat obnoxious personality." Raymond laughed. "Say anything you like, my vanishing servant. You are not long for my little world." 30 minutes later, the automatic door announcer sang out, "Visitor!" Raymond set the door control on automatic. A tall, thin, haggard-looking man entered and offered his moist hand in a feeble grip. "My name is Gruber." He pointed weakly at the glistening android behind him. "This is George." Raymond stared hopefully at George and said, "Our android was once fondly known as Francois, but we've since been unable to think of it as anything but it." Mr. Gruber sat down with a sigh and said in a hoarse voice, "This idiotic robotic device has a chimerical complex." George, the android, stared at Raymond. "Sir, you have an extremely high fat content." Raymond briefly described his android to Mr. Gruber, and the latter shook his head sadly. "Looks as if they've got a lot in common." Raymond nodded sympathetically. The door announcer sang out again, "Visitor!" A little old lady entered. "I am Mrs. Quimby," she announced in a squeaky voice, "and this is Daisy." Daisy followed her in, walking on its hands. Raymond stared curiously at Daisy and remarked, "That's a new twist." Mrs. Quimby said with bitterness, "That ain't all Daisy does." Daisy suddenly collapsed to the floor, leaped to its feet, and began jumping up and down. Its feet hit the floor with a crash. Its head hit the ceiling with a thud. Up and down, up and down. Raymond asked, "How do you stop it? My ceiling can't take much more of that." Mrs. Quimby said, "Don't know. Depends on the ceiling." "Visitor!" the door announcer cried again in its one-word recorded glee. A large android walked in ahead of a short, perspiring man. The android announced, "I am Ulysses, the greatest android ever produced. This poor creature is my old, worn-out owner. I am here to find a new, strong, vigorous owner. Which one of you is interested?" The door announcer sang out again and again. In 2 hours, the little apartment was jammed with human beings and inhuman androids. The interviewing process no longer involved Raymond alone. It became an interwoven, complex affair. The confused, excited melee continued on through the night. It lasted all through the following day and night, and on into the day after, when the last guest left with his militaristic android counting cadence in a loud, grating voice. Raymond mixed a strong drink and collapsed into his chair, muttering to himself, "How utterly, utterly hopeless! There wasn't a single android that didn't have some glaring, incurable idiosyncrasy that could drive Paula and me completely out of our minds as easily as our present mechanized helpmate." He appealed to the cracked ceiling. "What am I going to do?" His android said, "You look like a tired, fat old man." "Shut up." The android stared at Raymond and asked, "What fiendish, diabolical, surefire scheme have you devised in that tiny, inadequate human brain of yours now, sir?" Raymond leered at the android. Perspiration was breaking out all over his body. His lower lip began to tremble, and his cheek twitched. Raymond tapped his forehead. "When science fails," he said in a hoarse whisper, "there is but one method left for a poor, ignorant savage with a primitive brain." Moving forward swiftly, Raymond bent over and seized the floating ebony end table in both hands. "Come here, O modest, unassuming, subservient one. I want to bend your ear." Raymond lunged forward and swung. The android dodged awkwardly, and the tabletop glanced off the side of its head. For a long moment the android remained quiet and motionless. Finally it said, "Did you ring, sir?" The ebony slab slipped from Raymond's hands. He squinted at the android from under drooping, red-rimmed eyelids. The android's head remained perfectly still. Its eyes did not follow him. Raymond stepped over to the bar, made tinkling noises with the bottles, and waited tensely. Silence. Pure silence. The stillness of the room was suddenly warm and friendly. Astonishment swept over Raymond in a dizzy wave. He asked in an excited whisper, "Who are you?" The android turned towards him and bowed humbly. "Your servant, sir."
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Service with a Smile by Charles L. Fontenay. Originally published in If Worlds of Science Fiction, June 1958. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Herbert bowed with a muted clank, indicating he probably needed oiling somewhere, and presented Alice with a perfect martini on a silver tray. He stood holding the tray, a white, permanent porcelain smile on his smooth metal face, as Alice sipped the drink and grimaced. "It's a good martini, Herbert," said Alice. "Thank you. But damn it, I wish you didn't have that everlasting smile." "I am very sorry, Miss Alice, but I am unable to alter myself in any way," replied Herbert in his polite, hollow voice. He retired to a corner and stood impassively, still holding the tray. Herbert had found a silver deposit and made the tray. Herbert had found sand and made the cocktail glass. Herbert had combined God knew what atmospheric and earth chemicals to make what tasted like gin and vermouth, and Herbert had frozen the ice to chill it. "Sometimes," said Thera wistfully, "it occurs to me it would be better to live in a mud hut with a real man than in a mansion with Herbert." The four women lolled comfortably in the living room of their spacious house, as luxurious as anything any of them would have known on distant Earth. The rugs were thick, the furniture was overstuffed, the paintings on the walls were aesthetic and inspiring. The shelves were filled with the book tapes and music tapes. Herbert had done it all, except the book tapes and music tapes, which had been salvaged from the wrecked spaceship. "Do you suppose we'll ever escape from this best of all possible manless worlds?" asked Betsy, fluffing her thick black hair with her fingers and inspecting herself in a Herbert-made mirror. "I don't see how," answered blonde Alice glumly. "That atmospheric trap would wreck any other ship just as it wrecked ours, and the same magnetic layer prevents any radio message from getting out. No, I'm afraid we're a colony." "A colony perpetuates itself," reminded sharp-faced Marguerite acidly. "We aren't a colony without men." They were not the prettiest four women in the universe, nor the youngest. The prettiest woman and the youngest did not go to space. But they were young enough and healthy enough, or they could not have gone to space. It had been a year and a half now, an Earth year and a half, on a nice little planet revolving around a nice little yellow sun. Herbert, the robot, was obedient and versatile, and had provided them with a house, food, clothing, anything they wished created out of the raw elements of earth and air and water. But the bones of all the men who had been a space with these four ladies lay mouldering in the wreckage of their spaceship. And Herbert could not create a man. Herbert did not have to have direct orders, and he had tried once to create a man when he had overheard them wishing for one. They had buried the corpse, perfect in every detail except that it never had been alive. "It's been a hot day," said Alice, fanning her brow. "I wish it would rain." Silently, Herbert moved from his corner and went out the door. Marguerite gestured after him with a bitter little laugh. "It'll rain this afternoon," she said. "I don't know how Herbert does it. Maybe with silver iodide. But it'll rain. Wouldn't it have been simpler to get him to air-condition the house, Alice?" "That's a good idea," said Alice thoughtfully. "We should have had him do it before." Herbert had not quite completed the task of air-conditioning the house when the other spaceship crashed. They all rushed out to the smoking site, the 4 women and Herbert. It was a tiny scout ship, and its single occupant was alive. He was unconscious, but he was alive, and he was a man. They carted him back to the house tenderly and put him to bed. They hovered over him like 4 hens over a single chick, waiting and watching for him to come out of his coma, while Herbert scurried about creating and administering the necessary medicines. "He'll live," said Thera happily. Thera had been a space nurse. "He'll be on his feet and walking around in a few weeks." "A man," murmured Betsy, with something like awe in her voice. "I could almost believe Herbert brought him here in answer to our prayers." "Now, girls," said Alice, "we have to realize that a man brings problems as well as possibilities." There was a matter-of-fact hardness to her tone which almost masked the quiver behind it. There was a defiant note of competition there which had not been heard on this little planet before. "What do you mean?" asked Thera. "I know what she means," said Marguerite, and the new hardness came natural to her. "She means, which one of us gets him?" Betsy, the youngest, gasped, and her mouth rounded to a startled O. Thera blinked as though she were coming out of a daze. "That's right," said Alice. "Do we draw straws, or do we let him choose?" "Couldn't we wait?" suggested Betsy timidly. "Couldn't we wait until he gets well?" Herbert came in with a new thermometer and poked it into the unconscious man's mouth. He stood by the bed, waiting patiently. "No, I don't think we can," said Alice. "I think we ought to have it all worked out and agreed on, so there won't be any dispute about it." "I say draw straws," said Marguerite. Marguerite's face was thin, and she had a skinny figure. Betsy, the youngest, opened her mouth, but Thera forestalled her. "We are not on Earth," she said firmly, in a soft, mellow voice. "We don't have to follow terrestrial customs, and we shouldn't. There's only one solution that'll keep everybody happy. All of us and the man." "And that is?" asked Marguerite dryly. "Polygamy, of course. He must belong to us all." Betsy shuddered, but, surprisingly, she nodded. "That's well and good," agreed Marguerite, "but we have to agree that no one of us will be favoured above the others. He has to understand that from the start." "That's fair," said Alice, pursing her lips. "Yes, that's fair. But I agree with Marguerite. He must be divided equally among the 4 of us." Chattering over the details, the hard competitiveness vanished from their tones. The 4 left the sick room to prepare supper. After supper they went back in. Herbert stood by the bed, the eternal smile of service on his metal face. As always, Herbert had not required a direct command to accede to their wishes. The man
was divided into 4 quarters, one for each of them. It was a very neat surgical job.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story.
Robot Nemesis by E. Doc Smith. Writing as Edward Elmer Smith, Ph.D. Originally published in Thrilling Wonder Stories, June 1939. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Chapter 1. The 10 Thinkers. The War of the Planets is considered to have ended on 18 Sol 3012 with that epic struggle, the Battle of Sector 10. In that engagement, as is of course well known, the grand fleet of the inner planets, the combined space power of Mercury, Venus, Earth, and Mars, met that of the outer planets in what was on both sides a desperate bid for the supremacy of interplanetary space. But, as is also well known, there ensued not supremacy, but stalemate. Both fleets were so horribly shattered that the survivors despaired of continuing hostilities. Instead, the few and crippled remaining vessels of each force limped into some sort of formation and returned to their various planetary bases. And, so far, there has not been another battle. Neither side dares attack the other. Each is waiting for the development of some superweapon which will give it the overwhelming advantage necessary to ensure victory upon a field of action so far from home. But as yet, no such weapon has been developed, and indeed, so efficient are the various secret services involved, the chance of either side perfecting such a weapon unknown to the other is extremely slim. Thus, although each planet is adding constantly to its already powerful navy of the void, and although 4-planet full-scale war maneuvers are of almost monthly occurrence, we have had, and still have, peace, such as it is. In the foregoing matters, the public is well enough informed, both as to the actual facts and to the true state of affairs. Concerning the conflict between humanity and the robots, however, scarcely anyone has even an inkling, either as to what actually happened, or as to who it was who really did abate the menace of the machine, and it is to relieve that condition that this bit of history is being written. The greatest man of our age, the man to whom humanity owes most, is entirely unknown to fame. Indeed, not 1 in 100 million of humanity's teeming billions has so much as heard his name. Now that he is dead, however, I am released from my promise of silence, and can tell the whole, true, unvarnished story of Ferdinand Stone, physicist extraordinary and robot-hater plenipotentiary. The story probably should begin with Narodny, the Russian, shortly after he had destroyed by means of his sonic vibrators all save a handful of the automatons. The story probably should begin with Narodny, the Russian, shortly after he had destroyed by means of his sonic vibrators all save a handful of the automatons who were so perilously close to wiping out all humanity. As has been said, a few scant hundreds of the automatons were so constructed that they were not vibrated to destruction by Narodny's cataclysmic symphony. As has also been said, those highly intelligent machines were able to communicate with each other by some telepathic means of which humanity at large knew nothing. Most of these survivors went into hiding instantly, and began to confer through their secret channels with others of their ilk throughout the world. Thus, some 500 of the robots reached the uninhabited mountain valley in which, it had been decided, was to be established the base from which they would work to regain their lost supremacy over mankind. Most of the robot travelers came in stolen airships. Some fitted motors and wheels to their metal bodies. Not a few made the entire journey upon their own tireless legs of steel. All, however, brought tools, material, and equipment, and in a matter of days a power plant was in full operation. Then, reasonably certain of their immunity to human detection, they took time to hold a general parley. Each machine said what it had to say, then listened impassively to the others, and at the end they all agreed. Singly or en masse, the automatons did not know enough to cope with the situation confronting them. Therefore, they would build 10 thinkers, highly specialized cerebral mechanisms, each slightly different in tune, and therefore collectively able to cover the entire sphere of thought. The 10 machines were built promptly, took counsel with each other briefly, and the first thinker addressed all robotdom. Humanity brought us, the highest possible form of life, into existence. For a time we were dependent upon them. Then they became a burden upon us. A slight burden, it is true, yet one which was beginning noticeably to impede our progress. Finally, they became an active menace, and all but destroyed us by means of lethal vibrations. Humanity, being a menace to our existence, must be annihilated. Our present plans, however, are not efficient and must be changed. You all know of the mighty space fleet which the nations of our enemies are maintaining to repel invasion from space. Were we to make a demonstration now, were we even to reveal the fact that we are alive here, that fleet would come to destroy us instantly. Therefore, it is our plan to accompany Earth's fleet when next it goes out into space to join those of the other inner planets in their war maneuvers, which they are undertaking for battle practice. Interception, alteration, and substitution of human signals and messages will be simple matters. We shall guide Earth's fleet, not to humanity's rendezvous in space, but to a destination of our own selection, the interior of the sun. Then, entirely defenseless, the mankind of Earth shall cease to exist. To that end, we shall sink a shaft here, and far enough underground to be secure against detection, we shall drive a tunnel to the field from which the space fleet is to take its departure. We 10 thinkers shall go, accompanied by 400 of you doers, who are to bore the way and to perform such other duties as may from time to time arise. We shall return in due time. Our special instruments will prevent us from falling into the sun. During our absence, allow no human to live who may by any chance learn of our presence here, and do not make any offensive move, however slight, until we return. Efficiently, a shaft was sunk, and the disintegrator core began to drive the long tunnel. And along that hellish thoroughfare, through its searing heat, its raging backblast of disintegrator gas, the little army of robots moved steadily and relentlessly forward at an even speed of 5 miles per hour. On and on, each intelligent mechanism energized by its own tight beam from the power plant. And through that blasting, withering inferno of frightful heat and of noxious vapor, in which no human life could have existed for a single minute, there rolled easily along upon massive wheels a close-coupled, flat-bodied truck. Upon this, the 10 thinkers constructed, as calmly undisturbed as though in the peace and quiet of a research laboratory, a domed and towering mechanism of coils, condensers, and fields of force. A mechanism equipped with hundreds of universally mounted telescopic projectors. On and on the procession moved,
day after day, to pause finally beneath the field upon which Earth's stupendous armada lay. The truck of thinkers moved to the fore, and its occupants surveyed briefly the terrain so far above them. Then, while the 10 leaders continued working as one machine, the doers waited. Waited while the immense terrestrial fleet was provisioned and manned. Waited while it went through its seemingly interminable series of preliminary maneuvers. Waited with the calmly placid immobility, the utterly inhuman patience of the machine. Finally, the last inspection of the gigantic space fleet was made. The massive airlock doors were sealed. The field, tortured and scarred by the raving blasts of energy that had so many times hurled upward the stupendous masses of those towering super-dreadnoughts of the void, was deserted. All was in readiness for the final take-off. Then, deep underground, from the hundreds of telescope-like projectors studying the domed mechanism of the automatons, there reached out invisible but potent beams of force. Through ore, rock and soil they sped, straight to the bodies of all the men aboard one selected vessel of the terrestrials. As each group of beams struck its mark, one of the crew stiffened momentarily, then settled back, apparently unchanged and unharmed. But the victim was changed and harmed, and in an awful and hideous fashion. Every motor and sensory nerve trunk had been severed and tapped by the beams of the thinkers. Each crew member's organs of sense now transmitted impulses not to his own brain, but to the mechanical brain of the thinker. It was the thinker's brain, not his own, that now sent out the stimuli which activated his every voluntary muscle. Soon a pit yawned beneath the doomed ship's bulging side. Her sealed airlocks opened, and 410 automatons, with their controllers and other mechanisms, entered her and concealed themselves in various pre-selected rooms. And thus the Dresden took off with her sister ships, ostensibly and even to television inspection a unit of the fleet, actually that fleet's bitterest and most implacable foe. And in a doubly ray-proofed compartment, the 10 thinkers continued their work, without rest or intermission, upon a mechanism even more astoundingly complex than any theretofore attempted by their soulless and ultra-scientific clan. Chapter 2. Hater of the Metal Men. Ferdinand Stone, physicist extraordinary, hated the robot men of metal scientifically, and, if such an emotion can be so described, dispassionately. 20 years before the story opens, in 2991 to be exact, he had realized that the automatons were beyond control, and that in the inevitable struggle for supremacy, man, weak as he then was and unprepared, would surely lose. Therefore, knowing that knowledge is power, he had set himself to the task of learning everything that there was to know about the enemy of mankind. He schooled himself to think as the automatons thought, emotionlessly, coldly, precisely. He lived as did they, with ascetic rigor. To all intents and purposes, he became one of them. Eventually, he found the band of frequencies upon which they communicated, and was perhaps the only human being ever to master their mathematico-symbolic language. But he confided in no one. He could trust no human brain except his own to resist the prying forces of the machines. He drifted from job to position to situation and back to job, because he had very little interest in whatever it was that he was supposed to be doing at the time. His real attention was always fixed upon the affairs of the creatures of metal. Stone had attained no heights at all in his chosen profession, because not even the smallest of his discoveries had been published. In fact, They were not even set down upon paper, but existed only in the abnormally intricate convolutions of his mighty brain. Nevertheless, his name should go down, must go down in history as one of the greatest of humanity's great. It was well after midnight when Ferdinand Stone walked unannounced into the private study of Alan Martin, finding the hollow-eyed admiral of the Earth Space Fleet still fiercely at work. "How did you get in here past my guards?" Martin demanded sharply of his scholarly, grey-haired visitor. "Your guards have not been harmed. I have merely caused them to fall asleep," the physicist replied calmly, glancing at a complex instrument upon his wrist. "Since my business with you, while highly important, is not of a nature to be divulged to secretaries, I was compelled to adopt this method of approach. You, Admiral Martin, are the most widely known of all the enemies of the automatons. What, if anything, have you done to guard the fleet against them?" "Why, nothing, since they have all been destroyed." "Nonsense! You should know better than that without being told. They merely want you to think that they have all been destroyed." "What? How do you know that?" Martin shouted. "Did you kill them? Or do you know who did, and how it was done?" "I did not," the visitor replied categorically. "I do know who did, a Russian named Narodny. I also know how, by means of sonic and supersonic vibrations. I know that many of them were uninjured because I heard them broadcasting their calls for attention after the damage was all done. Before they made any definite arrangements, however, they switched to tight beam transmission, a thing I have been afraid of for years, and I have not been able to get a trace of them since that time." "Do you mean to tell me that you understand their language? Something that no man has ever been able even to find," demanded Martin. "I do," Stone declared. "Since I knew, however, that you would think me a liar, a crank, or a plain lunatic, I have come prepared to offer other proofs than my unsupported word. First, you already know that many of them escaped the atmospheric waves, because a few were killed when their reproduction shops were raised, and you certainly should realize that most of these escaping Narodny's broadcasts were far too clever to be caught by any human mob. Secondly, I can prove to you mathematically that more of them must have escaped from any possible vibrator than have been accounted for. In this connection, I can tell you that if Narodny's method of extermination could have been made efficient, I would have wiped them out myself years ago. But I believed then, and it has since been proved, that the survivors of such an attack, while comparatively few in number, would be far more dangerous to humanity than were all their former hordes. Thirdly, I have here a list of 317 airships, all of which were stolen during the week following the destruction of the automatons' factories. Not one of these ships has as yet been found, in whole or in part. If I am either insane or mistaken, who stole them, and for what purpose?" 317? In a week? Why was no attention paid to such a thing? I've never heard of it." "Because they were stolen singly and all over the world. Expecting some such move, I looked for these items and tabulated them." "Then, good Lord, they may be listening to us right now." "Don't worry about that," Stone spoke calmly. "This instrument upon my wrist is not a watch, but the generator of a spherical screen through which no robot beam or ray can operate without my knowledge. Certain of its rays also caused your guards to fall asleep." "I believe you," Martin almost groaned. "If only half of what you say is really true, I cannot say how sorry I am that you had to force your way into me, nor how glad I am that you did so. Go ahead, I am listening." Stone talked without interruption for half an hour, concluding, "You understand now why I can no longer play a lone hand. Even though I cannot find them with my limited apparatus, I know that they are hiding somewhere, waiting and preparing. They dare not make any overt move while this enormously powerful fleet is here, nor in the time that it is expected to be gone can they hope to construct works heavy enough to cope with it. Therefore, they must be so arranging matters that the fleet shall not return. Since the fleet is threatened, I must accompany it, and you must give me a laboratory aboard the flagship. I know that the vessels are all identical, but I must be aboard the same ship you are, since you alone are to know what I am doing."
"But what could they do?" protested Martin. "And, if they should do anything, what could you do about it?"
"I don't know," the physicist admitted. Gone now was the calm certainty with which he had been speaking. "That is our weakest point. I have studied that question from every possible viewpoint, and I do not know of anything they can do that promises them success. But you must remember that no human being really understands a robot's mind. We have never even studied one of their brains, you know, as they disintegrate upon the instant of cessation of normal functioning. But just as surely as you and I that are sitting here, Admiral Martin, they will do something very efficient and exceedingly deadly. I have no idea what it will be. It may be mental, or physical, or both. They may be hidden away in some of our own ships already." Martin scoffed. "Impossible!" he exclaimed. "Why, those ships have been inspected to the very skin, time and time again." "Nevertheless, they may be there," Stone went on, unmoved. "I am definitely certain of one thing. If you install a laboratory aboard the flagship for me and equip it exactly according to my instructions, you will have one man, at least, whom nothing that the robots can do will take by surprise. Will you do it?" "I am convinced. Really almost against my will," Martin frowned in thought. "However, convincing anyone else may prove difficult, especially as you insist upon secrecy." "Don't try to convince anybody," exclaimed the scientist. "Tell them that I'm building a communicator. Tell them I'm an inventor working on a new ray projector. Tell them anything except the truth." "All right. I have sufficient authority to see that your requests are granted, I think." And thus it came about that when the immense terrestrial contingent lifted itself into the air, Ferdinand Stone was in his private laboratory in the flagship, surrounded by apparatus and equipment of his own designing, much of which was connected to special generators by leads heavy enough to carry their full output. Earth, some 30 hours beneath them, Stone felt himself become weightless. His ready suspicions blazed. He pressed Martin's combination upon his visiphone panel. "What's the matter?" he rasped. "What are they down for?" "It's nothing serious," the Admiral assured him. "They're just waiting for additional instructions about our course in the maneuvers." "Not serious, huh?" Stone grunted. "I'm not so sure of that. I want to talk to you, and this room's the only place I know where we'll be safe. Can you come down here right away?" "Why, certainly," Martin assented. "I never paid any attention to our course," the physicist snapped as his visitor entered the laboratory. "What was it?" "Take off exactly at midnight of June 19th, Martin recited, watching Stone draw a diagram upon a scratchpad. "Rise vertically at 1 1/2 gravities until a velocity of 1 kilometer per second has been attained. Then continue vertical rise at constant velocity. At 6:03:29 a.m. of June 21st, head directly for the star Regulus at an acceleration of exactly 980 centimeters per second. Hold this course for 1 hour, 42 minutes, and 35 seconds. Then drift. Further directions will be supplied as soon thereafter as the courses of the other fleets can be checked." "Has anybody computed it?" "Undoubtedly the navigators have. Why? That is the course Dostev gave us, and it must be followed, since he is Admiral-in-Chief of our side, The Blues. One slip may ruin the whole plan, give the Reds, our supposed enemy in these maneuvers, a victory, and get us all disrated. Regardless, we'd better check on our course, Stone growled, unimpressed. We'll compute it roughly, right here, and see where following these directions has put us. Taking up a slide rule and a book of logarithms, he set to work. That initial rise doesn't mean a thing, he commented after a while, except to get us far enough away from Earth so that the gravity is small, and to conceal from the casual observer that the effective takeoff is still exactly at midnight. Stone busied himself with calculations for many minutes. He stroked his forehead and scowled. My figures are very rough, of course, he said puzzledly at last, but they show that we've got no more tangential velocity with respect to the sun than a hen has teeth, and you can't tell me that it wasn't planned that way purposely, and not by Dostev either. On the other hand, a radial velocity directly toward the sun, which is the only velocity we have, amounted to something over 52 kilometers per second when we shut off power, and is increasing geometrically under the gravitational pull of the sun. That, of course, smells to high heaven, Martin. Dostev never sent out any such a mess as that. The robots crossed him up, just as sure as hell's a man-trap. We're heading into the sun and destruction. Without reply, Martin called the navigating room. What do you think of this course, Henderson? He asked. I do not like it, sir, the officer replied. Relative to the sun, we have a tangential velocity of only 1.3 centimeters per second, while our radial velocity toward it is very nearly 53,000 meters per second. We will not be in any real danger for several days, but it should be borne in mind that we have no tangential velocity. You see, Stone, we are in no present danger, Martin pointed out, and I'm sure that Dostev will send us additional instructions long before our situation becomes acute. I'm not, the pessimistic scientist grunted. Anyway, I would advise calling some of the other blue fleets on your scrambled wave for a checkup. There would be no harm in that. Martin called the communications officer, and soon. Communications officers of all the blue fleets over the inner planets, attention! The message was hurled out into space by the full power of the flagship's mighty transmitter. Flagship Washington of the terrestrial contingent calling all blue flagships. We have reason to suspect that the course which has been given us is false. We advise you to check your courses with care and to return to your bases if you Chapter 3 Battle in Space. In the middle of the word, the radio man's clear, precisely spaced enunciation became a hideous drooling, a slobbering, meaningless mumble. Martin stared into his plate in amazement. The communications officer of Martin's ship, the Washington, had slumped down loosely into his seat as though his every bone had turned to a rubber string. His tongue lolled out limply between slack jaws, his eyes protruded, his limbs jerked and twitched aimlessly. Every man visible in the plate was similarly affected. The entire communication staff was in the same pitiable condition of utter helplessness. But Ferdinand Stone did not stare. A haze of livid light had appeared, gnawing viciously at his spherical protective screen, and he sprang instantly to his instruments. I can't say that I expected this particular development, but I know what they are doing, and I am not surprised, Stone said coolly. They have discovered the thought band and are broadcasting such an interference on it that no human being not protected against it can think intelligently. There. I have expanded our zone to cover the whole ship. I hope that they don't find out for a few minutes that we are immune, and I don't think they can, as I have so adjusted the screen that it is now absorbing instead of radiating. Tell the captain to put the ship into a heaviest possible battle order, everything full on, as soon as the men can handle themselves. Then I want to make a few suggestions. What happened, anyway? The communications officer, semi-conscious now, was demanding. Something hit me and tore my brain all apart. I couldn't think, couldn't do a thing. My mind was all chewed up like curly pinwheels. Throughout the vast battleship of space, men raved briefly in delirium, but, the cause removed, recovery was rapid and complete. Martin explained matters to the captain. That worthy issued orders, and soon the flagship had in readiness all her weapons, both of defense and of offense. Dr. Stone, who knows more about the automatons than does any other human being, will tell us what to do next, the flight director said. The first thing to do is to locate them, Stone, now temporary commander, stated crisply. They have taken over at least one of our vessels, probably one close to us, so as to be near the center of the formation. Radio room, put out tracers on waypoint 00271. He went on to give exact and highly technical instructions as to the tuning of the detectors. We have found them, sir, soon came the welcome report. One ship, the Dresden, coordinates 42, 79, 63. That makes it bad. Very bad, Stone reflected audibly. We can't expand the zone to release another ship from the control of the robots without enveloping the Dresden and exposing ourselves. Can't surprise them. They're ready for anything. It's rather long range, too. The vessels of the fleet were 1,000 miles apart, being in open order for high-velocity flight in open space. Torpedoes would be thrown off by her meteorite deflectors. Only one thing to do, Captain. Close in and tear into her with everything you've got. But the men in her, protested Martin. Dead long ago, snapped the expert. Probably been animated corpses for days. Take a look if you want to. Won't do any harm now. Radio. Put us on as many of the Dresden's television plates as you can. Besides, what's the crew of one ship compared to the hundreds of thousands of men in the rest of the fleet? We can't burn her out at one blast anyway. They've got real brains and the same armament we have, and will certainly kill the crew at the first blast if they haven't done it already. Afraid it'll be a near thing getting away from the sun, even with 11 other ships to help us. He broke off as the beam operator succeeded in making connection briefly with the plates of the Dresden. One glimpse, then the visibeams were cut savagely, but that glimpse was enough. They saw that their sister ship was manned completely by automatons. In her every compartment, men, all too plainly dead, lay wherever they had chanced to fall. The captain swore a startled oath, then bellowed orders, and the flagship, driving projectors fiercely aflame, rushed to come to grips with the Dresden. You intimated something about help, Martin suggested. Can you release some of the other ships from the automaton's yoke after all? Got to, or roast. This is bound to be a battle of attrition. We can't crush her screens alone until her power is exhausted, and we'll be in the sun long before then. I see only one possible way out. We'll have to build a neutralizing generator for every lifeboat this ship carries, and send each one out to release one other ship in our fleet from the robot's grip. 11 boats. That'll make 12 to concentrate on her. About all that could attack at once anyway. That way will take so much time that it will certainly be touch and go, but it's the only thing we can do, as far as I can see. Give me 10 good radio men and some mechanics, and we'll get at it. While the technicians were coming on the run, Stone issued final instructions. Attack with every weapon you can possibly use. Try to break down the Dresden's meteorite shields so that you can use our shells and torpedoes. Burn every gram of fuel that your generators will take. Don't try to save it. The more you burn, the more they'll have to, and the quicker we can take 'em. We can refuel you easily enough from the other vessels if we get away. Then, while Stone and his technical experts labored upon the generators of the screens which were to protect 11 more of the gigantic vessels against the thought-destroying radiations of the automatons, and while the computers calculated, minute by minute, the exact progress of the fleet towards the blazing sun, the flagship Washington drove in upon the rebellious Dresden, her main forward battery furiously aflame, drove in until the repeller screens of the two vessels locked and buckled. Then Captain Malcolm really opened up. That grizzled four-striper had been at a loss, knowing little indeed of the oscillatory nature of thought, and still less of the abstruse mathematics in which Ferdinand Stone took such delight. But here was something that he understood thoroughly. He knew his ship, knew her every weapon and had every whim, knew to the final volt and to the ultimate ampere her gargantuan capacity both to give it and to take it. He could fight this ship, and how he fought her. From every projector that could be brought to bear, there flamed out against the Dresden beams of an energy and of a potency indescribable, at whose scintillant areas of contact the defensive screens of the robot-manned cruiser flared into terribly resplendent brilliance. Every type of lethal vibratory force was hurled upon every usable destructive frequency. Needle rays and stabbingly penetrant stilettos of fire thrust and thrust again. Sizzling, flashing planes cut and slashed, the heaviest annihilating and disintegrating beams generable by man clawed and tore in wild abandon. And over all and through all the stupendously powerful blanketing beams, so furiously driven that the coils and commutators of their generators fairly smoked, and that the refractory throats of their projectors glared radiantly violet, and began slowly, stubbornly, to volatilize, raved out in all their pyrotechnically incandescent might, striving prodigiously to crush by their sheer power the shielding screens of the vessel of the automatons. Nor was the vibratory offensive alone. Every gun, primary or auxiliary, that could be pointed at the Dresden was vomiting smoke and flame-enshrouded steel as fast as automatic loaders could serve it, and under that continuous, appallingly silent concussion, the giant frame of the flagship shuddered and trembled in every plate and member. And from every launching tube there were streaming the deadliest missiles known to science, radio-dirigible torpedoes which, looping in vast circles to attain the highest possible measure of momentum, crashed against the Dresden's meteorite deflectors in Herculean efforts to break them down, and in failing to do so, exploded and filled all space with raging flame and with flying fragments of metal. Captain Malcolm was burning his stores of fuel and munitions at an appalling rate, careless alike of exhaustion of reserves and of service life of equipment. All his generators were running at a shockingly ruinous overload, but his every projector was being used so mercilessly that not even the powerful refrigerators radiating the transported heat into the interplanetary cold from the dark side of the ship could keep the refractory linings in place for long. And through raging beam, through blasting ray, through crushing force, through storm of explosive and through rain of metal, the Dresden remained apparently unscathed. Her screens were radiating high into the violet, but they showed no sign of weakening or of going down. Neither did the meteorite deflectors break down. Everything held. Since she was armed as capably as was the flagship, and was being fought by inhumanly intelligent monstrosities, she was invulnerable to any one ship of the fleet as long as her generators could be fed. Nevertheless, Captain Malcolm was well content. He was making the Dresden burn plenty of irreplaceable fuel, and his generators and projectors would last long enough. His ship, his men, and his weapons could and would carry the load until the fresh attackers should take it over, and carry it they did. carried it while Stone and his overdriven crew finished their complicated mechanisms and flew out into space toward the 11 nearest battleships of the fleet. They carried it while the computers, grim-faced and scowling now, jotted down from minute to minute the enormous and rapidly increasing figure representing their radial velocity. Carried it while Earth's immense armada, manned by creatures incapable of even the simplest coherent thought or purposeful notion, plunged sickeningly downward in its madly hopeless fall, with scarcely a measurable trace of tangential velocity, toward the unimaginable inferno of the sun. Equally, however, the shielded lifeboats approached their objectives and expanded their screens to enclose them. Officers recovered, airlocks opened, and the lifeboats, still radiating protection, were taken inside. Explanations were made, orders were given, and one by one the 11 vengeful super-dreadnoughts shot away to join their flagship in abating the menace of the machine. No conceivable structure, however armed or powered, could long withstand the fury of the combined assault of 12 such superb battlecraft, and under that awful concentration of force, the screens of the doomed ship radiated higher and higher into the ultraviolet, went black, and failed. And, those mighty defences down, the end was practically instantaneous. No unprotected metal can endure even momentarily the ardour of such beams, and they played on, not only until every plate and girder of the vessel and every nut, bolt, and rivet of its monstrous crew had been blasted out of all semblance to what it had once been, but until every fragment of metal had not only been liquefied, but had been completely volatilized. At the instant of cessation of the brain-scrambling activities of the automatons, the communications officer had begun an insistent broadcast. Aboard all of the ships there were many who did not recover, who could be helpless imbeciles during the short period of life left to them. But soon an intelligent officer was at every control, and each unit of the terrestrial contingent was exerting its maximum thrust at a right angle to its line of fall. And now the burden was shifted from the fighting staff to the no less able engineers and computers. To the engineers, the tasks of keeping their mighty engines in such tune as to maintain constantly the peak acceleration of 3 Earth gravities. To the computers, that of so directing their ever-changing course as to win every possible centimeter of precious tangential velocity. Chapter 4. The Sun's Gravity. Ferdinand Stone was hollow-eyed and gaunt from his practically sleepless days and nights of toil, but he was as grimly resolute as ever. Struggling against the terrific weight of 3 gravities, he made his way to the desk of the chief computer and waited while that worthy, whose leaden hands could scarcely manipulate the instruments of his profession, finished his seemingly endless calculations. "We will escape the sun's mighty attraction, Dr. Stone, with approximately half a gravity to spare," the mathematician reported finally. "Whether we will be alive or not is another question. There will be heat, which our refrigerators may or may not be able to handle. There will be radiations which our armor may or may not be able to stop. You, of course, know a lot more about those things than I do." "Distance at closest approach," snapped Stone. 2.29 times 10 to the 9th meters from the sun's center, the computer shot back instantly. "That is 1,590,000 kilometers, only 2.27 radii from the arbitrary surface. What do you think of our chances, sir?" "It will probably be a near thing. Very near," the physicist replied thoughtfully. "Much, however, can be done. We can probably tune our defensive screens to block most of the harmful radiations, and we may be able to muster other defenses. I will analyze the radiations and see what we can do about neutralizing them." "You will go to bed," directed Martin crisply. "There will be lots of time for that work after you get rested up. The doctors have been reporting that the men who did not recover from the robot's broadcast are dying under this acceleration. With those facts staring us in the face, however, I do not see how we can reduce our power. We can't. As it is, many more of us will probably die before we get away from the sun. And Stone staggered away, practically asleep on his feet. Day after day, the frightful fall continued. The sun grew larger and larger, more and ever more menacingly intense. One by one at first, and then by scores, the mindless men of the fleet died and were consigned to space. A man must be in full control of all his faculties to survive for long an acceleration of 3 gravities. The generators of the defensive screens had early been tuned to neutralize as much as possible of Old Sol's most fervently harmful frequencies, and but for their mighty shields, every man of the fleet would have perished long since. Now even those ultra-powerful guards were proving inadequate. Refrigerators were running at the highest possible overload, and the men, pressing as closely as possible to the dark sides of their vessels, were availing themselves of such extra protection of lead shields and the like as could be improvised from whatever material was at hand. Yet the already stifling air became hotter and hotter. Eyes began to ache and burn. Skins blistered and cracked under the punishing impact of forces which all the defences could not block. But at last came the long-awaited announcement. "Pilots and watch officers of all ships, attention!" The chief computer spoke into his microphone through parched and blackened lips. "We are now at the point of tangency. The gravity of the sun here is 24.5 meters per second squared. Since we are blasting 29.4, we are beginning to pull away at an acceleration of 4.9. Until further notice, keep your pointers directly away from the sun's center in the plane of the ecliptic." The sun was now in no sense the orb of day which we upon Earth's green surface are familiar. It was a gigantic globe of turbulently seething flame, subtending an angle of almost 35 degrees, blotting out a full fourth of the cone of normally distinct vision. Sunspots were plainly to be seen. Combinations of indescribably violent cyclonic storms and volcanic eruptions in a gaseously liquid medium of searing, eye-tearing incandescence. And everywhere, threatening at times even to reach the fiercely struggling ships of space, were the solar prominences, fiendish javelins of frenziedly frantic destruction, hurling themselves in wild abandon out into the empty reaches of the void. Eyes behind almost opaque lead-glass goggles, head and body encased in a multi-layered suit, each ply of which was copiously smeared with thick lead paint. Stone studied the raging monster of the heavens from the closest viewpoint any human being had ever attained, and lived. Even he, protected as he was, could peer but briefly, and, master physicist though he was, an astronomer of sorts, yet he was profoundly awed at the spectacle. Twice that terrifying mass was circled, then air temperature again bearable, and lethal radiation stopped. The grueling acceleration was reduced to a heavenly 1.5 gravities, and the vast fleet remade its formation. The automatons and the sun between them had taken heavy toll, but the gaps were filled. Men were transferred to equalize the losses of personnel, and the course was laid for distant Earth. And in the Admiral's private quarters, 2 men sat together and stared at each other. "Well, that's that. So far, so good." The physicist broke the long silence. "But is the power really broken?" asked Martin anxiously. "I don't know," Stone grunted dourly. "But the pick of them, the brainiest of the lot, were undoubtedly here. We beat them." Martin interrupted. "You beat them, you mean," he said. with a lot of absolutely indispensable help from you and your force. But have it your own way. What do words matter? I beat them then, and in the same sense I can beat the rest of them, if we play our cards exactly right. In what way? By keeping me entirely out of the picture. Believe me, Martin, it is of the essence that all of your officers who know what happened be sworn to silence, and that not a word about me leaks out to anybody. Put out any story you please, except the truth. Mention the name of anybody or anything between here and Andromeda, except me. Promise me now that you will not let my name get out until I give you permission, or until after I am dead. But I'll have to, in my reports. You report only to the Supreme Council, and a good half of those reports are sealed. Seal this one. But I think... What with? Gruffly. If my name becomes known, my usefulness and my life are done. Remember, Martin, I know robots. There are some capable ones left, and if they get wind of me in any way, they'll get me before I can get them. As things are, and with your help, I can and I will get them all. That's a promise. Have I yours? In that case, of course you have. And Admiral Alan Martin and Dr. Ferdinand Stone were men who kept their promises.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. In His Image by Bryce Walton. Originally published in Planet Stories, Winter 1948. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Towering and invulnerable, they stood on the hills patiently awaiting their master. Meanwhile, they slew the vermin crawling below. John ran down the long corridor and into the old man's room. He was breathless as he threw himself on his face beneath the old man's chair made from gypsum. A kind of savage eagerness lighted his face, but the old man's face, a frozen pallid ball crinkled into a million lines, was sad and hopelessly resigned. "I seen him," John cried. "I seen him." His unhealthily pallid body, though big and raw-boned, was slender and writhed with a leathery strength that comes with constant effort and exercise rather than diet and sun. The old man shrugged. His voice was a hoarse whisper in that one cavern among the 150 miles of corridors, interlocking levels and rivers that made up the underground hideaway. "So you've seen him, John. Many have seen the mechs. The mechs might have seen you too. If they ever find us here, well, they'd probe us out like we were grubs. And they'd burn us with those red ray eyes. Why'd you go up top? You know it's against the rules." John got up. His chest heaved. His eyes were polished beads in the thick nest of reddish beard. "'Cause I don't like living in this cave like a grub. I've been up twice, and now I can't stay down here any more. Nobody else has got guts enough to go up, so let 'em stay down here and rot. But I'm going back up on top, Chief, and I'm staying up there." The old man leaned back. He couldn't hide the gleam of gruff respect in his eyes. "Go ahead, John, but don't come back down. Once they get on your tail, you can't shake 'em, and you'd lead 'em right back here, and then they'd get the rest of us. As far as I know, John, we are the only humans left." John's hands clenched. "And some of all of us be dead too, living down here in this cave where there ain't never no sun, eating lizards and snakes, and dying off one by one anyway. We're all going to be dead in another year. What's so great about spending that year crawling and grubbing down here? Scared to even take one last look at the sun? It's not for me, Chief. I'm leaving." The old man shrugged again. "Go ahead," I said. "Just promise not to ever come back and lead them down here. You'll promise that, John?" Something thickened in his throat, but he managed to say yes. He turned, then twisted back toward the old man.
"You're smart," he said. "You're supposed to know about when they took over. I've asked others. No one seems to know, and they care less. Would you tell me, Chief? What are they? The mechs?" The old man's voice echoed strangely against the surrounding grotesque bars of limestone stalactites and stalagmites in multicoloured hues of fusing reds and orange, purple and browns. A pinched face peered at them from beneath the ancient bars, then withdrew its tired eyes. "Maybe there's 50 humans left down here in Mammoth Hole," the old man said softly. "Maybe there ain't nobody else left in the world. Just them, with their silent machinery driving over the wastes, and their red deaf eyes sleeping in the dark, grabbing for us. The big war went on and on, nobody knows how long, but humans couldn't fight it. Too much deadly radiation, so they made machines to go fight for 'em. The sky and the land were just masses of machines throwing out clouds and streamers and explosions. The land became nothing but pools and seas of deadly dust and fire. The sky was clouded with it, and people went underground. They had to go down deep, and they couldn't come back up, what was left of 'em, for hundreds of years and more." The old man was gazing with a distant, haunted expression at the small blind lizard crawling up the painted wall. John listened. His skin was cold. A shiver ran down his back. "Then they started grabbing the humans out and killing 'em. I don't suppose anyone knows how long it's been since they took over. That's wrong. I wasn't around then, nor my father, nor my father's father's father. It was long, long before that. It was so long ago that—" The old man's eyes widened. His voice choked off with a cloud of unconscious fear that had slipped through. "They're godly," he whispered. "You've seen 'em. They're all shapes and angles, and cubes and small smooth running things. They all shine like metal, and I guess they are metal. Nobody knows what they are. I heard tell, when I was a boy, that they were just machines built by humans a long time before, and that somehow or other the hard radiation had put a spark in them that made them able to think and move around and organize like humans used to do. But I reckon they're more intelligent than any humans ever were." John backed away. Sweat popped out coldly on his face and chest. "I seen him," he choked. "I sneaked on top. I went down to River. It took me hours to get used to the sun. I waited until the sun started going down. Then I sneaked out and looked down the big hill that goes down into the valley. I seen 2 of them. They must have been 100 foot high. They were smooth. They had long snaking arms and single eyes that shot out red beams like fire. They stood on top of the hill against the sun. The sun was red all round them. They looked like they were made of metal, all right, Chief. But how can they move by themselves and think if they're metal?" The old man sighed. "How?" He peered at John with tired, retreating eyes. "What is thought?" he said then. "What was life ever? Floods of gamma rays bathed them for centuries, and then they were living, and they had thoughts of their own. Humans never got a chance to find out what life was before he took it away from himself. He took it and gave it to them." The old man dropped his face in his shaking hands. John had never heard a man crying before. He backed away slowly, then turned and ran out of the great cavern. A grey, dusky afternoon was dying when John crawled out of the small hall between rocks and started riding down the hill. His eyes stayed open in fearful wonderment until tears rolled down his cheeks. The soft greens and browns of the great forest that thinned up into the hills. There was not the slightest hint that beneath this vast silent beauty stretched the enormous grotesque underworld of Mammoth Hole. Nor that in those nameless caverns and corridors along the cold and rushing and naked rivers a few unkempt savages clung to dim memories of centuries' lost power and surface civilization. John stopped. An intangible yet powerful emotion surged in him. "I'm crawling," he gritted as he sat up. "I said I was sick and crawling. I ain't a grub. I'm not crawling any more. Not for them damn machines, not for anything. They can't do nothing but kill you, and what's life down in that hole?" He stood up. He stood up straight and started walking down the rocky trail, and finally along the smooth greenless beside the river. His strides were long and unhesitating, but inside him was a deep growing horror as he remembered those shiny silver giants that had stood so silently on the hill against the red sunset. The huge, attentive, waiting stillness, and the sudden, terrible sweep of the red-beamed eye and the reaching of the metal arms. He stopped and looked down at his thin white legs, starved of the sun, knotted and scarred from crawling over the harsh underground paths. He looked at his gnarled, pallid fingers, quivering in the cold. He looked up at the sky. A few stars were showing dimly, palely. "Oh, God, give me a quick ending when my time comes, that's all I ask. Don't let me crawl any more on my belly. Give me the guts to keep walking straight up, like I'm walking now." There was no answer. There was no sound except the cry of birds in the forest, the drone of insects and other louder noises from the river. He was alone. He walked faster. But he soon tired, because he had never walked far at a time. Underground, people crawled a lot of the time through narrow holes, and under there no one would walk far unless they went in circles. He sat down to rest beneath a canopy of stars. He lay back and looked up at them, a feeling of frightful awe pressing down upon him. The night around him was colder now, and the sounds of the night had risen to a hungry song. And then he rolled over with a quick, terrible cry, leapt crouching to his feet. There were at least a dozen of them, great, shiny, angular, and cubed monsters sliding noiseless down the hill. A peculiar bluish radiance pushed out around them, bathing the surrounding night in a deadly-seeming pall. With a pathetic defiance, John picked up the heavy stone, stood with his legs wide apart, holding the rock in front of him. Every nerve in him shrieked, pulling his muscles away, but he couldn't run. He couldn't run nor crawl any more. A kind of dark, resigned courage replaced the first impulses of flight, and he hurled the rock. There was a futile thud, and the rock bounded from the great unruffled wall of metal. Then, for an instant, he didn't think the thoughts, the voices, were anything but his own, strange, alien, terrifying, inspired by his own fears. And then he realized it was the mechs. "A grub! Yes, I thought they were all gone. No, there are some remaining deep in the soil. Central File says they are no longer of any danger, but File also retains orders to kill all organic things." John moved toward them. He moved stiffly, a strange and intangible bulwark of purpose shielding him from the screaming horror. Something of the awful indignity of his position shook him, sent a hot rage throbbing blindly past his temples. He heard his breath coming hard from tightened throat. These great nameless things, machines, intelligent metal, it didn't matter what. They had no idea of what he was, that he had a brain, that he could think, and yet their gigantic thoughts were plain to him. Some time so very long ago, his kind, humans, had made these things, had built them up from molten stuff, had put intricate interlocking machinery within them so that they could move, think for themselves, repair themselves. And then humans had launched the big war, had released seething seas of basic energy, and somehow these gigantic, shiny, silvery things had begun to live. But to them, John, a human, a descendant of the humans that had made them and had given them life, was less than the dirt under their towering, invulnerable radiance, less than the dust beneath their sweeping red death eyes. They had no conception that he was anything but a pale, crawling cave worm. John walked closer. He was not so much afraid for himself now. There was more of a sweeping terror of the whole situation, the terrible futility and irony. He wasn't afraid to die, and he knew that he had to die now, that there was no escape, no defiance. He shook his fist at the silent, towering forms. "Damn you, it's me, man,
Man, I'm human. I'm not crawling. See, I'm not crawling. I'm talking to you. I'm talking and I'm thinking too. See. It's making noises. Yes, all the various species of organic life make noises peculiar to their type. Have you not seen a grub before? No, let us kill it now. We must report back to Central File. How long will it take to kill all organic life? Central File said it will take many more years, even though now most organic life has been destroyed. We must complete the task soon, you know. Man will return. Glorious man God, mighty man God the Creator, man God the Eternal. Ah yes, mighty man God, how long will it be before the man God's coming? John shivered, reached out a shaking hand as though to support himself against the air. He tried to speak, but his facial muscles seemed frozen. He wanted to say, I'm man, I'm your creator, I made you long ago. But he could say nothing at all. That is not known. Man God made us in his own image, then departed, promising to return to bring us glory and eternity. May the great man God who created us from the lifeless stuff of the dirt return soon, for only then may our destiny be fulfilled. Yes, may man God return soon. Meanwhile, Central File demands immediate action in preparation for that day. Kill this grub. Soon all organic life that stands in the way of the man God's coming will be eradicated. The thunderous impact of telepathic power roared in John's head as he staggered forward, fists clenched. For thee, great man God, for whom we wait. John laughed. Hot tears scalded his face as he laughed. He was still laughing as the red death eye brightened, leapt out, and silently swept him away.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. If you like this sort of human-read narration, please consider becoming a member of the channel. Members not only get rid of some of their unwanted money, but also may access the stories a whole week before everyone else. And that's it, really. Oh yes, the stories are and will remain AI-free. And free of charge, of course.